It's time for everything you need to know about the Hollows. 2 weeks ago, I released this video going through everything you need to know about the Shinigami, including their power system and the world building of Soul Society. Before that, I made a video describing the very basics of the universe and outlining the fundamentals of the power system. This will be the third video in my Bleach Worldbuilding Series where we will be exploring the entire universe. The different races that exist within the different realms, their respective power systems, and everything else about them. Let's dive right into this. Much like the Shinigami, we don't have very many specific dates for certain events in the history of the Hollows. The only concrete thing we know is that the world took on its current form sometime over 1,000,000 years ago. That's when the separate realms were created. Before the Soul Society and Hueco Mundo's creation, there was no border between life and death, a time known as the Primordial Age. In my previous video about the Shinigami, I explained how the Soul King who ruled during this age was sealed and mutilated by the ancestors of Soul Society's 5 great noble families. But all that really matters for the purposes of this video is that Hollows existed during that primordial age, and we can infer that they were very different to the Hollows we are familiar with in the current day. How these Hollows came into existence is something left completely unclear. All we do really know is that even in this age there was a cycle of Reishi. The Hollows eventually began devouring humans at a ridiculous rate which completely halted this cycle, threatening the state of the entire universe. All of those souls devoured by the Hollows came together to form one gigantic Hollow, the first ever Menos Grande, and thus the world became completely still. And then the Soul King came into being and destroyed this massive Hollow that is made up of what we can only assume to be millions of souls of Reiatsu combined. The Menos was turned into Sands of Reishi, which was eventually used to create Hueco Mundo by the ancestors of the 5 great noble families. During the time between that event 1,000,000 years ago and the current timeline, Hueco Mundo has gone through very drastic changes. In only the last 100 years, there's been 3 separate rulers of the realm, which is a tiny fraction of its history. Hueco Mundo has never had a centralized government or military. In the Hollow world, the strongest calls the shots. You either eat or you are eaten. One day, Baragan, who eventually serves under Aizen as the second Espada, was naturally born as a Vasto Lord Menos. He conquered the realm and crowned himself the God King of Hueco Mundo at some unknown time before the start of the story. He turned the wasteland into a place with some semblance of order. He had his own court of hollows, he claimed a fortress and named it Las Noches, which eventually became the heart of the realm. Baragan's first real threats came in the form of a massive ancient hollow known as Ikomokidomoe. They came to acknowledge each other's strength and even made a pact that they would never interfere with each other, out of acknowledgement that the other could very well kill them. Then Aizen came into the picture. Alongside Gin and Tosen, he usurps Baragan and takes over Las Noches. After what we can only assume to be hundreds of years of unchallenged rule, Baragan had grown quite complacent. He notes that he is bored, wondering what point there is in having an army if you have nobody to fight. He states that he's been considering splitting his army into 2 and have them battle to the death simply for some form of entertainment, welcoming Aizen in hopes he'll provide him with something like that. Of course, he couldn't have known just who he was talking to, but clearly Baragan doesn't just hand over his kingdom to Aizen, he's simply too prideful to do so. There was definitely some battle involved, or Aizen just used Kyoka Suigetsu to handle him, but the ultimate point is that Hueco Mundo becomes Aizen's territory. Following this, he establishes the Espada and makes some pretty big changes to the realm. Aizen builds a new version of Las Noches, creates a sunlit sky within the fortress, and really just tries to introduce civilization in the realm that has only ever known conflict and bloodshed. And that brings us to the start of the story and the current day, where everything is as we see in both the Arrancar and 1000-Year Blood War arcs. Following Aizen's defeat at the hands of Ichigo, Tia Haribel takes command of Hueco Mundo for a short-lived tenure as Yhwach is reborn and takes it from her with ease. I am fully aware there are so many side stories regarding Hueco Mundo in the light novels, but I want to focus on the most important details, bringing us to the current day. The race of hollows, if we can even call them a race, are born from the souls of humans that do not cross over to Soul Society after their deaths. The reason for this ranges anywhere from despair, regret, or unfinished business from their lifetime spent as a human. This is explicitly explained by Rukia in chapter 28. One of the Shinigami's main jobs, which we discussed in the previous video, is to perform the console ritual on pluses, which is crucial not just for the cycle of souls, but to prevent the birth of hollows. Any soul who is not guided to Soul Society via the console ritual may eventually turn into a hollow. A good example of this process is Orihime's older brother, Sora. Together they fled from their abusive parents and became the most important people to each other. Then Sora died in a tragic car accident, and when he became a plus, he became increasingly obsessive of Orihime. With limited ways to interact with the living, many pluses find that they are unable to cope when their loved ones moved on. And this is exactly what happened to Sora. He became filled with jealousy at the fact Orihime began praying for him less and less, and instead starts praying for her new friends in Tatsuki and Ichigo. He eventually became a hollow, and ironically, this process would have the focus of his obsession, his younger sister Orihime, be his first victim had Ichigo not been there to save her. The process of a plus turning into a hollow is visually depicted through the chain of fate, which resides in the center of a plus's chest. The chain of fate slowly corrodes over time, coinciding with the degradation of the soul's ties to the living world. This corrosion can be accelerated under specific conditions, such as when a plus is attacked by a hollow or they have given in to extreme despair. When the chain completely decays, the soul is reborn as a hollow, and in place of the chain of fate, a hole opens up on their chest, signifying that they have lost their heart. Pluses who are not able to leave the human world because they regret leaving something behind are known as either Jubakure or Tsukire. The primary distinction being that Jubakure are bound to a place, whereas Tsukire are bound to a person, making Orihime's older brother a Tsukire. A demi-hollow is a Jibakure or Tsukire that's in the process of evolving into a hollow, but this process can take anywhere from weeks to months. Once a soul becomes a hollow, it is driven by an eternal and insatiable hunger to devour other souls, both living and dead, to fill the void where their heart once was. Most hollows become mindless creatures concerned only with finding the most potent souls to devour, those high in spiritual power. This is why Ichigo's home is attacked in the very first chapter. The hollow was drawn there by Ichigo's exceedingly potent Reryoku for a human. Other than humans, the races in Bleach's world have a specific theme which each take inspiration from a certain culture and language. Kubo has actually been asked if there is any specific meaning behind his language choices, to which he responded, "For the Arrancar, I thought that Spanish sounds very passionate and a little erotic, which matches their wild lifestyle. German sounds cold, harsh, and methodic, something that matches the straightforward methods of the Quincy's. I'd also like to use French at some point because it sounds very elegant, but I can't figure out a good way to include it into the story. I guess that means characters in the Hell Arc are gonna be speaking French, which is oddly fitting." The Quincy are inspired by the German, with Quincy in German literally meaning monk of destruction. The Shinigami are inspired by the Japanese, with Shinigami in Japanese meaning god of death, and the hollows are inspired by the Spanish, with the word hollow translating to hueco in Spanish and hueco mundo meaning hollow world. These themes fashion so many aspects of their respective race, even having an instrumental role in their soundtracks. We all know the greatness of the Espada's soundtracks. And what we've been getting in the 1000-Year Blood War for the Quincy. While most hollows are evil, or at the very least mindless, there are quite a few exceptions who we meet across the story. Nell and her adoptive brothers Dondochaka and Piche are good examples of this. Others include Grimjow and his pack. They are definitely evil, but they're not mindless and are capable of camaraderie and loyalty. His subordinates voluntarily sacrificed parts of themselves for the sake of Grimjow's growth. The hollows aren't nearly as one-dimensional as they may seem, seem on the surface. There is a hierarchy within their race, and certain special hollows with sentience and freedom of choice do exist, though Kubo does make it very clear that these guys are mostly demonic and violent. Interestingly, the stronger a hollow is, the more it begins to resemble the human it once was. The white, skull-like masks they wear are formed from the hearts they had lost as humans. This mask protects the naked instinct which is left in a being after the loss of its heart, the very essence of their soul, and it also obscures the original identity of the hollow. It can be shattered, temporarily allowing the hollow to regain its original identity, but it will regenerate after a short period once the hollow takes over again. This fundamental aspect of their appearance is one of the only things that's consistent among all hollows. Other than the mask, they all differ greatly in terms of how they look. They very rarely appear the same, but the one metric of their appearance that can be consistent is their size, only among the classification of Menos. As I stated, the stronger a hollow, the more it begins to resemble a human, and their differences in size among the classification of Menos is a clear visual indicator of that. The only artificially created pure hollow we know of in the series is White, who lives within Ichigo and was created by Aizen. I would not be surprised if there have been others in the very long history of the universe, but without something like the Hogyoku, they would never have posed a universal threat. The destruction of hollows by a Shinigami Zanpakuto is a pretty interesting concept, because Shinigami aren't actually killing them, but rather purifying them of the sins they committed as a hollow, thus returning them to their former state of being a plus. This allows the spirit to enter the Soul Society normally, as if they never became a hollow to begin with, but in cases where the hollow was a terrible person as a mortal and committed great sins, its return to a plus will summon the gates of hell. This is exactly why the Quincy's methods of handling hollows is so problematic. Rather than purifying them, they completely destroy them, including their souls, which has disastrous effects on the cycle of souls and just general balance of the universe. That is everything you need to know about the race of hollows from a fundamental standpoint, but we'll be going much deeper and begin looking at different Menos classification and what makes an Arrancar in just a few minutes. Before that though, let's talk about the hollow world. Hueco Mundo is a place for the restless dead, the hollows who know of nothing but hunger. Just like its inhabitants, Hueco Mundo is empty, composed of an endless desert of white sands and odd tree-like objects under a perpetual black sky. These trees aren't plants, but rather made up of a quartz-like substance, further emphasizing just how lifeless this realm truly is. Strong winds can stir up sandstorms, and some inhabitants of Hueco Mundo wear capes and cloaks to protect themselves from those storms. Much like the Soul Society, the atmosphere of Hueco Mundo is composed of reishi. In this case, fairly strong reishi, stronger than Soul Society's, which is sufficient enough to nourish small hollows without them needing to feed on other hollows to survive. The world is in constant nighttime, and the moon of Hueco Mundo has a direct opposite lunar cycle to that of the human worlds, further reiterating that humans and hollows are opposites. Hueco Mundo exists somewhere between the human world and the Soul Society, but its exact location is unknown. It is separated from the bordering dimension between the human world and the Soul Society, known as the Dangai, which means there's only one thing connecting Hueco Mundo to the rest of the universe, and that brings us onto the Garganta. In Can't Fear Your Own World, we get this line: if the world of the living and the Soul Society could be likened to planets, and the pipeline that connected them were the Dangai, the void of space that surrounded those was called Garganta. This is a simple metaphor used to explain Bleach's cosmology. Each realm is a spherical structure, much like our planets, that float around within the Garganta, much like space. However, the Garganta isn't actually space. It's a void of turbulent reishi. Unlike the space we know, you can breathe in the Garganta, and you can't access it by just leaving the atmosphere of any realm. This hypothetical diagram on screen right now perfectly captures what I mean. It's it's a separate dimension that you can't physically travel to, hence why I had to make it clear that this is not actually space. For example, you can't just fly off of Soul Society and enter the Garganta like you would leave Earth and enter space. You need to open a dimensional portal to access the Garganta. Much like the Dangai, which connects the Soul Society and the human world, time functions differently within the Garganta. This Garganta connects Hueco Mundo to the other realms. Hollows travel between dimensions as they see fit through the Garganta. There are multiple ways in which one can access this void of turbulent reishi. The Kumon is a spatial distortion which Gillians typically use to travel between realms. The Keikaigi is a Kido technique used by Urahara, which connects the space tying two worlds together to open a portal to the Garganta. This opening is generated between two large wooden posts jutting out from two large rock formations. Descorrer is a technique used by Espada level Arrancar and sometimes others to open a portal to the Garganta in order to travel between realms. And lastly, Mayuri opened a portal into the Garganta using a device he found while in Hueco Mundo. Garganta means throat in Spanish and black cavity in Japanese, both of these meanings complementing each other very nicely and capturing exactly what the dimension feels like as a part of Bleach's cosmology. The only other named area that really matters with regards to Hueco Mundo is Las Noches. I'm aware there is also a Forest of Menos from episode 147 of the anime, which was actually confirmed to be canon by Kubo in volume 29, but other than the fact that exists, it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this video. Las Noches is a fortress located in Hueco Mundo, previously ruled by Baragan until Aizen usurped him and took control over the entire realm. This massive fortress can be seen for miles. It consists of a main building with a domed center surrounded by several large towers and smaller buildings. Atop the dome are 5 smaller towers which appear to contain areas such as Aizen's throne rooms and the Espada meeting hall. The inside of Las Noches' dome simulates the blue sky of the human world, something Aizen introduced once he took control over the fortress. Each of the Espada have their own area within Las Noches, of which we've seen 5. Stark's resting room, Haribel's palace, Zomari's meditation room, Zayaporo's lab, and Aroniero's palace. Tosen and Gin both have their own control rooms, and there's also a jail cell which Orihime was kept in for a short while. In comparison to the Soul Society, there isn't too much to talk about with regards to Hueco Mundo's physical world building. It's a barren wasteland, which perfectly suits its inhabitants. It doesn't really need to be any more than what it is. Finally, we arrive at the Menos, the subgroup of Hollow we are most interested in for the purposes of this video. The majority of Hollows come from a single human soul, but Menos, also known as Menos Grande, are the amalgamation of hundreds of normal Hollows, resulting in a single composite entity of far greater power. Menos are created when the void within an ordinary Hollow's heart becomes so substantial that human souls are incapable of sustaining it, at which point it begins devouring other Hollows. These cannibal Hollows are attracted to one another, and a mass devouring follows, resulting in the final cannibal Hollow that remains evolving into a Gillian. Following this transformation, the Gillian type Menos can evolve twice more, first into an Adjutus and finally into a Vasto Lord, provided certain conditions are met. Menos evolution is not only contingent upon the Menos eating other Hollows, but also upon the Menos' ability to avoid being eaten themselves. If another Hollow succeeds in devouring even a single part of their body, evolution becomes impossible for the one who is wounded this way. These guys are considered so dangerous that Soul Society sends only highly trained Shinigami teams to handle them, even if it's just a Gillian, the weakest type of Menos. Let's quickly break down everything we know about the 3 types of Menos. Gillian are the first and weakest of the Menos. There are many of them, they all look alike, and they're referred to as foot soldiers in an army of hollows. These are the Menos who are generally referred to in textbooks within Soul Society. They're kinda like the staple of Menos, since Ejutus and Vasto Lord are pretty rare to come across. In terms of appearance, they all look pretty similar. They're massive, have a white mask, and a nose that looks like Usopp's. Their bodies are covered from head to toe with a big black cloak. Around their neck is a row of thin white spikes. They have large white hands, long white nails, and very strong tongues that are capable of breaking a fellow hollow's mask. Though Gillians usually have no personality, which is what makes them so dangerous since they have no mind of their own, one of the many hollows within the Gillian might gain control over the newly formed entity, reflected in the unique mask it wears in comparison to a normal Gillian. Only these Gillian variants have the potential to evolve into Ejutus class Menos. Ejutus are the second type of Menos. They are much smaller than Gillians and far fewer in number, but they're also much smarter and much stronger than them. These guys give orders to the Gillians, usually leading them into battle. They're powerful enough to challenge a captain of the Gote 13. In terms of appearance, these guys can hugely vary anywhere from bulky humanoid hollows to the panther-like form of Grimmjow before he became an Arrancar. Due to how rare it is for a single hollow within a Menos to gain control over it, evolving even further from Ejutus to Vasto Lord is incredibly rare. So rare that only a few of these guys exist in all of Soul Society. Not only do they have to keep devouring other hollows, but they themselves can't be even slightly devoured, as previously explained. Vasto Lord are the final type of Menos, the highest level of evolution. Extremely rare in number, it is said that the amount of Vasto Lords within all of Hueco Mundo can be counted with the fingers on one's hands. It is also stated that the combat capabilities of these Vasto Lord are above those of captains of the Gote 13. These Vasto Lord are extremely small, roughly the same size as a human. As previously explained, the more powerful a hollow and more Reiatsu it has, the more it resembles a human. The process for the creation of a Vasto Lord is unknown. Grimmjow and his pack hypothesized that an Ejutus can become a Vasto Lord by devouring large amounts of hollows. However, Xiaolong and his group found this method to be ineffective. After devouring 3,000 hollows, Xiaolong speculated that a Vasto Lord is determined upon an individual's birth as a hollow, or perhaps even before that, introducing a layer of fate to the Vasto Lord, which strongly ties into the messaging of Bleach, especially in this saga. The Arrancar are hollows that have ripped off their masks and gained Shinigami-like powers, which is evidenced by the Spanish name Arrancar, directly translating as to tear off. An average hollow becoming an Arrancar isn't really a problem for the Gote 13, but the same cannot be said for Menos class hollows. Aizen's Hogyoku was used to turn many of the Menos living in Hueco Mundo into Arrancar, though there are also many natural born Arrancar like Stark, Baragan, and Urukyora. It's made quite clear that the Hogyoku Arrancar possess far greater power potential than natural born ones, which I guess is a huge testament to the strength of some of the top Espada who had no Hogyoku interference for their power. Arrancar differ from ordinary hollows in several ways, especially Vasto Lords. These guys have 100% humanoid forms, and the scale that's been implemented is basically the lower their intelligence, the more they look like hollows. The higher, the more they resemble humans. Each Arrancar has a unique estigma, which is a pattern that resembles a fragment of a hollow's mask. We also learned through Uryu's fight with Tsuruchi that Arrancar not only share the powers of Shinigami, but their anatomy as well. He aims for the area where the Saketsu would be located on a Shinigami, and upon striking it, Tsuruchi immediately loses not only her release form and estigma, but seemingly all traces of her former power. And finally, the Arrancar Zanpakuto. These things are entirely different from the Zanpakuto that Shinigami used, but they're pretty interesting, and we'll be talking about them later on when we explain the Hollow's power systems. The Arrancar under Aizen's command have a standard theme for their clothing. Their uniforms consist of a white jacket, black sash, white hakama, which is a traditional type of Japanese trousers, black tabi, which are traditional Japanese socks, and white zori, which are traditional Japanese sandals. These outfits bear an opposing similarity to the outfits of the Shinigami. It's essentially just an inversion of the Shinigami uniform, which provides some very interesting interplay between the two races, especially considering how the Arrancar serve as villains and antagonists, but don predominantly white outfits, which tend to be associated with the good guys across literature. The Arrancar make up the bulk of Aizen's strongest troops within his military. Despite not having a formal government, the strongest inhabitants of Hueco Mundo do make up a military which is ruled over by Aizen, or at least was ruled over by him, known as Aizen's Arrancar army. We don't know if this specific military structure was intact before Aizen usurped Baragan, but we do know that Baragan did have underlings. Each member of Aizen's army has a number tattooed somewhere on their body which correspond with their rank within the army. The meaning of this number differs depending on which unit the Arrancar is part of. The Privaron Espada are former members of the Espada that have been demoted either for losing strength or losing usefulness to Aizen. This happened to Grimjow temporarily after his arm was cut off by Torsen. The three main Privaron Espada were number 103 Dordoni, number 105 Cirucci, and number 107 Mosqueda. These 3-digit numbers were assigned to them and tattooed onto their bodies when they lost their Espada ranks, and they reside in the Tres Cifras. Dordoni stated that the Privaron Espada were all naturally created and rendered obsolete once Aizen began creating Arrancar artificially to meet his own standards, reiterating the superiority of Hogyoku Arrancar. Then there are the Numeros, who make up the bulk of the Arrancar numbers. The moment a holo is reborn into an Arrancar, it is assigned a 2-digit number starting from 11. This number indicates the order of their birth, hence the higher the number, the younger they are. The strongest amongst the Numeros can be handpicked by Aizen and promoted to Espada, which is why they're constantly trying to prove themselves. Fractions are Numeros who serve a specific Espada. As proof of their status as the strongest, the Espada have the right to select subordinates from among the Numeros to supervise directly. They can choose however many Fraction or none at all. The Ejequias act as the execution division for Aizen's army. Radborn is their only true member, with the rest of the group consisting of the Calaveras, which are created by his Resurreccion's ability. This unit is responsible for terminating rebels or intruders in Las Noches, and they are subordinate to the Espada. They also clean up after each battle, collecting data before killing any survivors. They killed Dordoni for failing to win against Ichigo, and they killed Cirucci for failing to win against Uryu. And finally, the top brass of Aizen's army, the Espada. They are the top 10 ranked and most powerful Arrancar in Aizen's army. And unlike the Numeros, their numbers don't indicate the order of their birth, but rather the amount of Reryoku they have, 0 having the most Reryoku and 9 having the least. It is implied that along with Aizen, Gin, and Torsen, the Espada as a group possesses comparable strength to the Gote 13 captains. Aizen clearly has a lot of respect for the Espada's abilities, addressing them as his dear Espada and sitting at the head of the same table with them while discussing his plans. He is comfortable confiding in them with goals of destroying Karakura town and creating an Oken, even allowing the location of the Hogyoku to be public knowledge among them. However, this isn't just out of trust and respect, but an unwavering confidence in his own ability to handle any betrayal if the need arises. Each of the Espada at the time of Fate Karakura town embody one of the 10 aspects of death, a thematic underpinning for their characters. We don't really get any exposition on where these aspects of death come from, and if this is something purely symbolic or not, but I assume they are related to the lives they lived as humans, the source of pain within their hollow holes and thus the source of their power. The number 9 Espada was Aroniero Arurueri, who embodied greed, a very fitting symbol for the one who gained power by eating other souls and absorbing their abilities. He was the only member of the first generation Espada to not be demoted to a Privaron Espada, and at some point in the past he gained the powers of Kai and Shiba by absorbing the hollow who killed and fused with the former lieutenant. He's also the only member of the Espada to have been a Gillian before becoming an Arrancar, the weakest class of Menos. The fact he had no Fraction under his wing and clearly preferred to be alone suited his abilities and general personality as a cunning, underhanded manipulator who lurked in the shadows. He was ultimately killed in his battle against Rukia, where his greed is most evident, as he prioritizes torturing her over quickly killing her to his own detriment. The number 8 Espada was Zairoporo Granz, who embodied madness. Given he was the mad scientist of Aizen's army, this makes perfect sense. Zaya was killed by Mayuri and dragged into hell, where he now serves as a jailer. We receive a staggering amount of information on Zairoporo's past in the light novels, specifically Spirits Are Forever With You, but that's a topic for another day. I haven't read that one yet. He is highly narcissistic and just generally quite sadistic, viewing others as little more than research material. Among the Espada, Zairoporo has by far the most fraction. He personally modified each of them so that he can heal his wounds by eating them. The only named fraction under his wing were Lumina, Verona, and Medazepi, all unknown numbers. The number 7 Espada was Zomari Ruro, who embodied hedonism, a very interesting symbol given his personality as this super calm and contemplative dude who's always meditating in his residence. But as we learn from his battle against Byakuya, this is but a facade that quickly crumbles under pressure. His overzealous nature is his downfall, leading him to severely underestimate Byakuya and ultimately be killed by him. His hedonism is most apparent with his obsessive devotion to Aizen, his last words praising his master. Like Aroniero, Zomari had no fraction. The number 6 Espada was Grimjao Jagerjak, who embodied destruction. He was temporarily replaced by Lupi for acting outside of Aizen's orders, but quickly returned to his position after killing them. Grimjao is an absolute madman. He's brutal, impulsive, and very violent. But despite this, he does have some form of code of honor, best seen when he's unwilling to fight against an injured Ichigo and tries to force Orihime to heal him. Before becoming an Arrancar, he was a panther-like Ajuchas class. He ruled over a group of other Ajuchas who were all, like him, trying to evolve into Vasto Lord. But despite devouring thousands of hollows, they simply couldn't progress onto that final stage. Grimjao's fraction is composed of those same Ajuchas he met in his past life before being reborn as an Arrancar. Xiaolong was the leader of those fraction until he was killed by Hitsugeya, and he was the number 11 numeros, making him the oldest of them all. Edred Leones was number 13 and killed by Ikaku. Nakim Grindina was number 14 and killed by Rangiku. Ilfort Grans, the older brother of Zairoporo, was number 15 and killed by Renji. And lastly, Deroy was number 16 and killed by Rukia. Grimjao stays alive until the very end of the Bleach manga. The number 5 Espada was Noitara Gilga, who embodied despair. He was once the number 8 Espada but reached the position of number 5 by defeating Neliel with the help of Zairoporo. There is a lot that can be said about Noitara. So much so, he honestly deserves his own analysis. It's quite difficult to summarize his character in just a few lines, but his aspect of death being despair says quite a lot about him. He was consumed by despair as a purposeless hollow. The only thing he found joy in was fighting, to fight until only he remains as the strongest being or until he dies. Very fitting that he dies at the hands of someone very similar to him in Kenpachi. He had one fraction, number 50, Tesra Lindo Cruz. The number 4 Espada was Urukyora Chifa, who embodied nihilism. He is one of the most unique members of the Espada. He isn't particularly violent despite his cold and dispassionate personality, and only fights when provoked to or ordered to by Aizen. Urukyora was ostracized by other hollows when he was born, due to being white, whereas those around him were all black. He wandered Hueco Mundo in complete isolation until he came across a white tree where he planned to commit suicide. He found the tree satisfying and sank into it, destroying part of his mask and rebirthing him into an Arrancar. His nihilism is most evident in his backstory and interactions with Orihime, where he genuinely cannot understand why she has so much faith in her friends and feels such profound feelings towards them. Ironically, it is only in his death where he is freed from this nihilism and comes to understand what it means to feel. Urukyora had no fraction and was killed by Ichigo in their battle on the dome of Las Noches. The number 3 Espada is Tia Haribel, who embodied sacrifice. She is calm and analytical, and her fraction consists of 3 female Arrancar known as the Tres Bestia, who have all followed Haribel since their pre-Arrancar times. Much like Urukyora, Haribel is quite a unique Arrancar. She shows a lot of love and empathy towards her fraction, and her hollow hole is located where a woman's womb would be, which ties into her aspect of death incredibly fittingly. Aizen attempted to kill and sacrifice her in fake Karakura town, but she survived and went on to rule over Hueco Mundo until Yhwach arrived over a year later and absolutely destroyed her. Her current status is unknown, but we can assume she's alive due to the fact she was never confirmed to be dead, which is something Kubo usually goes out of his way to do whenever a character does actually die. The number 2 Espada is Baragan Louisenbern, who embodied senescence, also known as old age. This coincides with his ability to dramatically accelerate the age of whatever he touches. We've spoken about Baragan a lot over the course of this video. He was the former king of Hueco Mundo before Aizen took over the realm, and in his final moments he attempts to kill Aizen in a pitiful showing where his attack doesn't even reach the king. Ironically, he is killed by Hachigen, who uses his own ability against him, killing Baragan with the very power he considered to be absolute. Baragan had many fraction who referred to him by his former title of royalty as Your Majesty, which implies they followed him even before they became followers of Aizen. These fraction include number 20 Charlotte Schulhorn, number 22 Abirama Reda, number 24 Findor Callius, number 25 Chou Neng Pao, number 26 Gio Vega, and number 27 Nirje Parduok. Crazy ass names. The number 1 Espada is Coyote Stark, who embodied solitude. This man was so lonely, he split his soul into 2 Arrancar in order to escape that loneliness. Lilynet Gingerbuck is the counterpart to his soul and his only fraction. He joined Aizen to meet others as powerful as himself, and the reason Stark was so lonely and envied those weaker than him is because his power was so ridiculous that simply being in his presence was enough to kill most hollows. All he ever wanted was friends, to not feel lonely, which makes his death at the hands of Shunsui especially tragic, given how he is burdened by extreme loneliness as well and has nobody to confide in with regards to his trauma. And finally, we arrive at number 0, with the perceived highest amount of Reiryoku among all Espada, Yami Lago, who embodied rage. Not much to say about this guy, he was just angry all the time and we were led to believe he was the number 10 Arrancar, but in his released form, the 1 melts away, leaving just the 0. He was killed by both Byakuya and Zaraki Kenpachi. The Espada are one of the most infamous villain groups in not just Bleach, but anime and manga as a whole. They represent the full extent of what Hollow is capable of in terms of power and sentience. Hopefully this quick breakdown of each of them was sufficient, and we can move on to the different powers exclusive to the Hollows. Hollows have their own set of powers, and Arrancar take it to the next level. So we'll start by going through the Hollow power system and then the Arrancar, even though it's technically the same thing since Arrancar are Hollows, but yeah, you know what I mean. Much like Shinigami, Hollows have a multitude of combat skills and abilities, most of which are usually unique depending on the Hollow. They usually acquire energy to power their abilities by devouring souls, but smaller ones can ingest energy from the atmosphere when in realms with a high concentration of spiritual energy, such as the Reishi constituted Soul Society and Hueco Mundo. The Reiryoku of a Hollow is essentially poison to a Quincy, completely destroying their souls were it to enter their bodies, which is why they are their sworn enemies and live to destroy them. Hollows have a number of named abilities, including soul-body separation, which allows a Hollow to forcibly extract a living spirit from their body. This isn't usually used by Hollows since most of them would rather just devour the spirit, but Orihime's brother did use this on her so they could speak with one another. Shrika also uses it to trap Yuichi in the body of a parakeet. Acidic touch is when a Hollow grabs a human with their hands and the area which they grabbed is burned as if acid were poured onto it. Pretty self-explanatory technique. This makes the Hollow's Reiatsu seep into the victim, which happened to both Orihime and Chad, and is widely believed to have awakened their abilities. The Sero is a highly powerful blast of energy which can be fired from various body parts, but this has only been used by Menos class Hollows, the Arrancar, and the Visored. We'll speak about this a little more shortly. Negation fields are used to rescue fellow Hollows. We've seen Gillian class Menos utilize this on some occasions. divisions. And finally, high-speed regeneration is pretty much explained by the name alone. It allows a holo to heal most of its injuries very quickly, with the exception of injuries to the head or vital organs. Urukyora states that most Arrancar trade in their high-speed regen for far greater strength, which brings us onto the Arrancar. As previously explained, Arrancar are holos that have removed their masks and gained Shinigami-like powers, and that really does capture the way they fight. These guys are very similar to the Shinigami, with some distinct differences. They even have their own Zanpakuto, though these things function completely differently to a Shinigami Zanpakuto. The Arrancar seal the nuclei of their abilities within the form of a sword, meaning when they release their Zanpakuto seal, they unleash their true powers and true forms. The combat efficiency of an Arrancar with a released Zanpakuto is increased several times over. I like to think of these release forms as an inversion of Bankai. Instead of them unleashing their Zanpakuto spirits, they are temporarily restoring themselves to their true form, bringing back their holo powers. This is known as a resurrection, which is activated with a command phrase followed by the name of their Zanpakuto. Very similar to a Bankai indeed. Arrancar powers are both similar to the Shinigamis and variations of ordinary holo powers. Bala is a technique that fires hardened reishi. It is much less powerful than the next technique, but it can be successively fired at 20 times the rate. And of course, the next technique is the Sero, which we just mentioned a couple minutes ago, a powerful blast of energy. There are countless unique variations within the Sero technique, such as Sero Doble, Sero Cornea, Sero Sincretico, the Gran Rey Sero, Sero Oscura, Sero Metraleta, and La Mirada. This is basically like the Holo Kamehameha, just a massive blast of energy. Hierro refers to the outer skin of an Arrancar, which has a high spiritual hardness and functions like armor. Pesquisa is an Arrancar's ability to measure and locate Reiatsu, much like the Shinigami's Reikaku. And finally, Sonido is the Arrancar's ability for high-speed footwork, the equivalent to a Shinigami's Shumpo. According to Urukyora, any Espada ranked 4th or higher are not allowed to release their Zanpakuto within Las Noches, nor are any of the Espada allowed to discharge a Gran Rey Sero, as both are powerful enough to destroy the majority of Las Noches, which is pretty insane given how massive Las Noches is. The abilities of each holo and each Arrancar are so vast and unique that there's honestly not much more I could say for the fundamental elements of their power system. How they go about using their Reiryoku is what sets them apart. After all, the vast amount of Reiryoku is what makes them such a threat to begin with. I honestly might make a video someday just as long as this one talking about each of the Espada's individual fighting style and how their abilities complement their characters, because much like the Shinigami, it's absolutely glorious just how many subtle bits of character work are packed into the smallest details of their abilities. The Visored aren't technically holos, but rather a group of Shinigami who have acquired holo powers through the use of Aizen's incomplete Hogyoku. They are the complete antithesis of the Arrancar. Visored are Shinigami who have gained holo powers, and Arrancar are holos who have gained Shinigami powers. There are 8 known Visored aside from Ichigo himself. Their story is covered in the Turn Back the Pendulum flashback, which takes us back in time 100 years ago in Soul Society. Let me know if you guys would like to see me cover that on this channel at some point in the future. These guys are completely indistinguishable from ordinary Shinigami, but by donning a holo mask, they gain access to their holo powers. They are all former captains and lieutenants within Soul Society. Actually, we might as well just quickly go through them. Shinji Hirako, the former captain of the 5th Division, Love Aikawa, the former captain of the 7th Division, Rojuro Otoribashi, more commonly known as Rose, who is the former captain of the 3rd Division, Kensei Muguruma, the former captain of the 9th Division, Mashiro Kuna, the former lieutenant of the 9th Division under Kensei, Hiyori Sarugaki, the former lieutenant of the 12th Division under Orohara, Hachigen Ushoda, the former lieutenant of the Kido Corps, and finally Lisa Yadomaru, the former lieutenant of the 8th Division. Shinji, Rose, Kensei, Mashiro, and Lisa were all reinstated to their former positions after Aizen's defeat, with the exception of Lisa, who wasn't just reinstated but promoted to captain of the 8th Division following the death of Yamamoto, and promotion of Shunsui to captain commander. When holofied, the Visored have enhanced speed, enhanced strength, enhanced endurance, and enhanced Reiryoku. They can also fire Seros just like the Arrancar, and their power is just generally augmented as they have both the power of a holo and the power of a Shinigami working in tandem. According to Aizen, the fusion of these two spiritual entities allows the Visored to reach power levels far surpassing that of either an exclusive holo or Shinigami. which explains why Ichigo is such a monster by the end of the series. We've finally reached the end of the video. These joints are hard to make, man. I'm fully aware that this is very different to the typical analysis content I make, but I plan to make it all come full circle by the end. All of the research that's required for these huge information-based videos is tiring, but it's also opening my eyes to a lot of details I missed in my read-through. There's just so many layers going into this universe and the different races that inhabit the different worlds. All of these things coalesce to create this incredibly convincing, multifaceted societal structure that constantly feeds into itself. It's one of the most interesting approaches to world building I've ever personally come across, and I cannot wait to finish this series so we can move on to analyzing everything I am explaining. Bleach's world building is fucking awesome, and I really hope this series can help convince more people of that fact. With that being said though guys, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys in 2 weeks where I explain everything you need to know about the Quincy.